Bonjour à toutes, bonjour à tous et bienvenue en ce mardi pour cette 3e édition du Paris Defense and Strategy Forum, organisé, comme vous le savez certainement, par l'Acadème, l'Académie de défense de l'école militaire. Je me présente, je suis François-Xavier Canova et je vais donc avec plaisir être votre fil rouge ici dans l'amphithéâtre Raoul Castex aujourd'hui pour créer évidemment le lien entre les différentes séquences de la journée. Ici, nous allons entendre des experts français et mondiaux, civils et militaires, mais également des autres autorités. Et avec eux, nous allons pouvoir analyser les grands enjeux qui redéfinissent aujourd'hui la défense et la stratégie à l'échelle mondiale. À l'heure où les recompositions géopolitiques s'accélèrent, où les cadres multilatéraux s'effacent et où les ruptures technologiques redessinent les rapports de force, la question de la souveraineté devient une véritable condition de la paix. Elle n'est plus envisagée comme un repli sur soi. C'est aujourd'hui le moyen de renforcer notre crédibilité militaire. Souveraineté, alliance et partenariat, voilà donc le thème central de cette 3e édition du PDSF, thème qui va bien sûr être abordé dans les échanges à venir, notamment aujourd'hui. Une souveraineté tout d'abord comme condition de résilience face aux nouveaux champs de conflictualité. Une souveraineté nationale combinée à une solidarité stratégique ou comment penser de nouvelles formes de coopération plus adaptées à nos enjeux et à l'échelle mondiale bien évidemment, et une souveraineté permettant de s'imposer comme une nation innovante, ça va de soi, qui prend un temps d'avance grâce aux nouvelles technologies. Voilà, le décor est planté. On va démarrer sans plus attendre notre programmation ici, dans l'espace Raoul Castex. Pour ceux qui doivent rejoindre d'autres espaces, mais j'imagine que ça aurait déjà été le cas, vous êtes invités à vous lever et à rejoindre ces fameux espaces. Et nous pouvons évidemment lancer donc cette première session. Alors quand on parle de souveraineté, ça implique l'autonomie d'appréciation et la capacité à anticiper, vous le savez certainement. C'est également la faculté de se donner les moyens d'atteindre un futur désirable. De ce fait, notre première séquence de cette journée, de ce mardi, s'impose comme une masterclass qui va vous donner les clés d'une méthode aussi originale que puissante pour mieux envisager l'avenir. James Rees et Nafkote Tamirat, j'espère que je n'écorche pas son nom, vous présentent ce matin la Fictional Intelligence, comprenez l'intelligence fictionnelle, comme une nouvelle méthodologie prospective qui allie techniques narratives créatives et données empiriquement vérifiées. Voici nos intervenants, vous pouvez donc les applaudir. Merci pour eux.
Hello, everyone can hear me? Good morning, thank you all for coming. We will each introduce ourselves, but first up is that a note that this next presentation will be in English. We love it? Perfect. So we're going to be talking to you about, thank you for the introduction, as he mentioned, fictional intelligence, which is a class that we teach here at the École de Guerre, Jim and I. Mathieu Sylvain is one of our officer students this year. He'll give a little presentation as well. So we want to talk to you about what this class is, what we believe the benefits are, what the genre is, because as you'll have figured out from the word fiction, there's a writing element, there's a creative element, and then we're going to we'll be passing out articles that we're going to be using as the basis for hopefully our own fictional scenario. And we'll talk more about this, but keep in mind that Fic-Int is a genre meant as a tool for strategic foresight. So that's where it has a lot of benefit and of course a lot of resonance for our students here. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Nafkote Tamirat. I'm a novelist, and I'm one of the co-founders and professors for the Fic-Int program.
And my name is James Rees, Jim. I'm also one of the co-founders of Fic-Int, and in addition to which, here under the umbrella of the English language instruction aspect of the PME that happens here, we also have something called U.S. Academic Writing, and Nafkote and I both coach in that program as well. But a couple of years ago, maybe 6 years ago now, we were approached with this idea of adding a creative element to the curriculum, and that became the Fic-Int that you're going to hear a lot more about today, both in terms of sort of meta, what it is, and then our hope is to have more of a workshop toward the end where you get to see what it looks like in action. Now over to Major Sylvain to introduce himself.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Major Mathieu Sylvain. I'm the student of Jim and Nafkote in US Academic Writing and in Fic-Int. So my point is just to share with you my user experience as a student here at École de Guerre.
And just so you know, so this session will finish at 1 p.m., but right before, we'll have a 10 to 15-minute Q&A for those who might be more interested in learning about FIC-INT, about our experiences, etc. So first of all, FIC-INT. I don't know if you saw in the description, it's all in caps. It's a portmanteau of fictional intelligence. And so at bottom, like in its most basic form, what this is a fictional genre that uses the tools of creative writing, which we'll get into more, the tools of fictional narrative, to project about 10 to 15 years into the future, to think about how can we use fiction to start to understand better what problems, what questions, what issues we might face going forward. So it employs imaginative, data-based narratives to explore these potential futures. A word here, of course, that this is not a model to predict the future, if only. This is just a way to try to fill in the gaps, to try to find the potential nuances of what we may be looking at as we move forward. As you can imagine, here at the School for the Officers, this has global import in many, many ways. And it engages with complex issues in a way that traditional analysis may struggle to convey. I don't have to tell you, we live in a world that is becoming more and more unpredictable, that is becoming harder and harder to kind of gauge, even just in terms of our present. And so we try to keep it to that 10 to 15 year timeline as we look forward, because past 15 years, we're thinking more in terms of science fiction, which Jim will talk about later. I'm here to tell you more about what it is, FIC-INT, and Jim will tell you what it's not. But what we also want to do is make sure that the officers, and in general, when we've worked with other groups as well, that when we use these tools, that we're trying to predict a future that we will have to live in, because it's not super helpful if you write a story and you're like, well, I hope the future generation can take care of that. We've seen how that works, right? So we want to think about what can we do concretely within our own paths, within our own career paths to work on this. So transforms approved data into compelling stories that highlight the human stakes, ethical dilemmas, and unintended consequences of decisions, and stimulates creative problem solving and engages more complex and broader audiences. We also always tell our students that, of course, there are other text-based ways to analyze. You can do memos, you can do white papers. By and large, those are not the most, narratively transformative experiences. They get across information, but they may not draw in an audience. And so what we found with this genre is that sometimes the people who are able to help when we think about future solutions, future paths forward, are not just the experts who are directly working in that field. There are other stakeholders, there are other audiences that might be helpful, and so how can you draw in those audiences so that they're aware of those issues, understand the stakes, and can understand how they might be able to participate in possible solutions going forward. So as I mentioned, we're here to do strategic foresight, not strategic prediction. This is a way to anticipate threats, we have found, and help prepare strategies. So we're building a bridge between imagination and foresight, offering a unique means of navigating an unpredictable present, but also near future. And I'll turn it over to Jim to talk about what this genre is not.
So very often in creative terms, sometimes the best way to learn how to do something is to sort of look at how not to do something. So along those lines, this would make anyone think of science fiction, but it really isn't science fiction. Other genres that are sort of on the periphery, weird fiction, speculative fiction, all of that feeds into what FIC-INT is. FIC-INT, what it tries to do, and there's a term that we sort of both abjure, which is sort of bandied about in this conversation, which is useful fiction. I hate the term because it implies that other fiction is less than useful. And as creative writers ourselves, I guess we missed that part in our introductions. Navkote and I are both novelists. So the notion of any fiction being less than useful, don't like the idea. But the idea is sort of there. So it isn't science fiction. It borders on the speculative. And as Navkote said, what it really is, it's a genre trying to communicate the human stakes in a fictional context, sort of to make the I say message, but careful with message. One thing you don't want to do is go into a piece of fic knowing what you want the end to be, because then you're just writing propaganda. The notion is to have something evolve naturally to convey what in the end is your message, to motivate your reader to action or contemplation, something more effective than, as Navkote said, a memo or a white paper typically does. So very briefly, over to Navkote now to tell you what the program looks like here at the École de Guerre.
So as Jim and I have both mentioned, we started this program in 2021, so it's been going strong for a few years now. We tend to have, and I'll talk a little bit as well about US academic writing, which as Jim mentioned, we also both teach in. So these classes, we usually have 10 to 15 modules every year for Fic Int, and most students are avid readers, especially of science fiction, but may never have written creatively before. So this is a leap in terms of that scope, but also, as you can imagine, this is also a module meant to help with English language acquisition. So not only are the soldiers being put into the deep end when it comes to creativity, they're also being asked to be creative, already a daunting prospect, in a language that they might not be super comfortable with. So we come at it from two different aspects. We want them to deepen their narratives, but we also want them to work on their English, both speaking and written. Jim and I are there really to work on the fic part, that fiction part, as novelists. The int, we know very little, but luckily we are at the École de Guerre and we have officers who know a ton about the int. So each officer decides what area they'd like to work on, and usually we try to help them narrow it down. So someone might come in and say, I want to think about climate change. Climate change is enormous. There's so many areas you can go into. And as we all know from the stories that we care about, they're specific. We have one character or a few. We have one storyline that we're following through. And so we help them with tools that we'll talk about a little bit later today, try to narrow that down, figure out where exactly they want to dive in and investigate, and then we help them come up with a compelling narrative. We do this also by reading, so they're writing at the same time. We have them bring in their pieces when it's a serviceable rough draft, and we workshop the piece as a class. So the other officers and us too as well, we ask them questions, we tell them what we think is working, we tell them what we think isn't working, and we try to give concrete examples and good feedback. So feedback that will lend itself to being able to work on it some more. So by the end of the module, each officer has a completed piece to submit. Now, we say short story to keep it broad, but we've had video game narratives before, we've had graphic novels, we try to play with form a lot as well. Do you want to write your story in the form of a newspaper article, which will be relevant for the piece we look at a little bit later? So things like that, but we also have them read a lot. As you can imagine, Fic Int, because I wonder, had anyone heard of Fic Int before today? Okay. So it's a fairly new genre, so there isn't a ton out there to read about. So we try to find speculative fiction, a little bit of science fiction that doesn't go too much into the fantastical realm, just so the officers can think about what do we like and what don't we like in this story. And then we dig further. If you don't like it, why is that? What isn't working for you? Try to name it, try to articulate it. Because as soon as you know what works and doesn't work for you as a reader, you're better able to figure out what works and doesn't work for you as a writer, and then you borrow the techniques that work and you do away with the ones that don't. And very briefly about US academic writing, that is very much a research paper course. The officers work in pairs, and they work with US partners. So that can be think tanks, that can be other kind of government associated groups, and then they write papers for them based on prompts that those groups give them. They write a research paper, and then at the end of the year we go to Washington, D.C., and they present their papers to their US partners. So in both ways, we're trying hard to figure out ways to use words, to use narrative, to use language, to bridge gaps and be able to connect audiences from, and in US academic writing course, transatlantically as well. And then I'll leave it to Jim to talk about the rest.
So one of the things that we hear repeatedly from the officers is how they love the creative aspect of this. And for us as instructors and as full-time creatives, one of the most exciting things and a great dynamic in a room is when you have very high-achieving individuals who find themselves out on a limb that they're not accustomed to being on. So either they disappear or they lean into it, and that's a very, very cool moment. And so one of the things over the typically 12, 15 weeks of the course, which again eventuates in a longer piece of fiction, is the brainstorming that goes into it. So if you imagine the room sometimes is 15, 20 officers who sign up for the module. Last year, for example, it was open to international officers, and I can't tell you how interesting that was. We had a Portuguese officer, an officer from Romania, from Singapore, and also they come with their particular fields of interests. I always hope that we have some medical professionals or people working in the medical field, because that's what FIC-INT is looking at. So the FIC is the human part of it. The INT is what are we thinking in terms of now, geopolitically or technically, that's going to have a major impact, ramifications in the next 10 to 15 years. Again, the idea being that this is something they would face in their own work lives. Other people might extend that 10 to 15 years a little bit, but as Navkote said, you get into the realm of science fiction then. And we want this, and I think this is one of the major pluses, the added value for it within PME, is that it's something that the officers have to think about that they will then have to maybe act on. So we have the brainstorming that goes into the room when they bring their INT before they're getting to their FIC, so maybe simultaneously. And it's very cool to have a conversation of someone conceiving of some technical thing we know now. What might that look like in 10, 12, 15 years? And then you have someone else with a completely different perspective. Maybe the Navy guy said something, and it falls to the Army guy to have to say, oh yeah, that's never going to work, and here's why. Leads to some interesting conversations, which in turn leads to another sort of oxymoron, which is sort of what we go by, which is creative collaboration. So when we can, Navkote will talk about this in a moment too, just to take a different approach to storytelling, we have all the officers write sort of a chain letter sort of thing, 300 words adding up to a long piece of fiction. So it's a very collaborative process. The officers are working on their own stories. The in-class discussions are very interesting, sharing all sorts of intel. And again, the idea always is to come up with something that will move your reader, both inform and move your reader in ways that typical processes, white papers, memos, etc., may not be able to achieve. The other thing is we have found that this is transposable to other sorts of venues too. So the INT can be anything. We've been asked to do this at corporate events where the focus is telecommunications or construction or logistics. So whatever the INT is, that can work in a piece of FIC-INT. Here, of course, and I should say that today we're not going to choose any of the many hot button topics we could choose that are more directly relevant in a military context. We're going to choose something that is about life in Paris related to climate change, because we leave all that more the expertise in those other fields to you folks. Our idea here today is, because we don't have time to make you all write a 15-page short story, although we would like that, is to sort of conceive of something, think more filmic. So today, in a moment, we're going to start walking through some of the processes, some of the tricks we give the officers as they become more creatives. And today, what we hope to achieve is sort of a real-time vision of a movie that we might see in lieu of a short story or the other sort of formats that FIC-INT can take. Now, we're going to turn it over to Matt now. Matt is here because he's our star student, and he has an interesting perspective because he's involved in both US academic writing and the FIC-INT module.
Thank you very much. I'm not a star at all. So basically, yes, I am part of the US academic writing, so I am writing a paper on AI, artificial intelligence and balance of power, and especially focusing on the cognitive biases that are amplified through AIs and how this impacts the decision-making processes. So this is some research work, and from this I take the INT and then I try to focus on a story, a short story, which is part of the FIC-INT program. And to be specific, it's still a work in progress. Sorry, Jim, for that. I am writing a short story about a future, let's say, within 15 years from now, where climate change has become so important that we needed that all the major weather forecasting powers are putting their effort together, and thanks to AI, are building the next generation of forecasting, weather forecasting. And from that, I elaborate a story where AI can get too autonomous and how this could have an impact on the humanity. So I think that's the perfect transition to our next workshop.
Thank you, Matt. Before we get into the article that we're going to be looking at for the bulk of this session, just one last word about what Jim mentioned about creative collaboration. We didn't do it this year, but in past years, what we've done is we've tried to do a version of the Exquisite Corpse game, but text-based. So as a reminder, because I'm sure you're all aware of this, this was kind of a surrealist parlor game, and the idea was that you'd be sitting around a table, you'd have a blank piece of paper, and then someone would draw a little item at the top, fold it down, you pass it to the next person, they draw, and then so on and so forth. At the end, when you unfold it, you have a creature, a notion, an idea that couldn't have been there unless those, however many people were assembled around the table. And so we tried to do that in the past with stories where we'd give the students a paragraph, a very short paragraph. We would decide beforehand, we'd brainstorm about what is the int, who do we want the characters to be, when is this, where is it, et cetera, nationality, all of that. And then based on that paragraph and based on the int that we'd already brainstormed, each officer would write about 300 words and then 300 words. And then somehow at the end, we would come up with a beginning, middle, end of a short story. And what we do that, A, because it's fun, but also because I think it's a reminder that within this genre in particular, what you're always trying to do is you're trying to create collaboration via your audience, but also via the people who create it. Because when it comes down to the int that the officers are looking at, these are complex issues. These are complex questions. If there was one answer, we would have found it by now, right? But we do need all of these different brains, all these different types of expertise, all of these different types of creativity to actually start to form a path forward that makes sense. So that idea of collaboration sounds nice, but it also has a very practical implementation as well. So something to keep in mind as we move into the article that we'll be looking at. But first, I'd like Jim to maybe walk us through a little bit of the first few narrative elements we're going to be asking you about.
So the officers come into the module the first day, and they've already been proving themselves brave enough to go out of that creative limb. So it would just be cruel of us to say, okay, start writing a story. So I want to make the point, number one, that this is art, that there are no formulas. Number two, we give them a few formulas because there has to be something to latch on to. So a couple of things. In addition to the basic who, what, where, when, why, and how that you need to always bear in mind as you're creating something, we ask them, okay, when you're thinking about your future scenario, it can go one of three ways. It can go better, it can go worse, or it can go weird. So that's another thing they keep in mind. But then the most practical thing that we give them is something that we discovered in reading. Actually, I was reading a biography of a writer I very much admire from active in the 70s, and found out that her short stories, which I thought Alice Adams published in the New Yorker, a great writer from California, and she said very simply, she always bore in mind this one little dictate that she got when she was in creative writing class in Stanford, which was an ABDCE means of progressing through a story. ABDCE, action, background, development, climax, ending. Then I went back and I read Alice Adams's very nuanced short stories and was amazed to see that that was there as a structure. So that's what we provide the officers with, something just to grasp onto as they start to practice their creativity. So the action can be anything. It can be a bomb going off. It can be someone who feels slighted at a typical Monday morning meeting. Whatever the inciting incident, whatever gets things going. So then we go to B, background. We go back to the who, what, where, when, why, and how. All of which has to be very subtly worked into the story. For example, if we're looking at something in the future, you may not say the date necessarily, but maybe you identify someone as the 53rd President of the United States, hoping that your reader knows currently, I believe we're at 47. Things like that, the subtlety, the artistic parts of working in this stuff, because the temptation, of course, is what we call an info dump, which nobody wants to read. Okay, so no info dumps, and again, to go back to something I said earlier, no propaganda. So the temptation is to go into this thinking, oh, I want to say this is my message. But that creatively is something sort of to be wary of. You want to arrive at a message, if we're going to call it a message, much more organically. So I'd say that's our big challenge, to help the officers come up with something that reads as an organic, workable piece of fiction, because if it isn't that primarily, it will serve no larger purpose as a work of fic-int. So that's action and background. I'll turn it over to Navkote to talk about the D, C, and E.
A last word about what Jim just mentioned. Remember also that we want to avoid kind of a fable structure where there's a moral at the end, because the point of these stories is, first of all, it's to be good fiction, which is much more interesting if the ending is a bit more complex, right? If you're not told exactly what to do. But it's also unhelpful if a piece of fiction tells you exactly what you should do. It's not going to actually lend itself to something more practical, which is what we're really hoping for with this genre. So Jim mentioned A and the B. The D is development. So this is where this, for most stories, this is the bulk of the story. Usually when someone asks you, oh, what is the story about? This is what you're talking about. It's the conflicts that arise. It's the challenges. This is where you build tension. This is where you raise the stakes. This is where we see characters start to shift in their dynamics, in their relationships, but also in their personalities. So this is the largest part of a story. And you're using that development, you're using that rising action to get to C, which is, of course, the climax. So this is where everything comes to a head. That can be the last battle, of course, if we're looking at Marvel, but it can also just be a turning point. From this onwards, nothing will be the same again, whatever that might be. And again, keep in mind, and we tell the officers this, that you can have multiple climaxes in a story, but you do want that to build, because if you have too much at one level, it gets a bit dull. We start to lose interest, we start to kind of get out of it. And then finally, E, of course, is the ending. So not only the actual literal conclusion, but who's left, what's left, where have the pieces landed, what can we do from here? And we're not necessarily looking for an ending that's an open ending, but one that's complex, right? One that lends itself to, these might be paths forward, but there's still a few questions left, right? Because we're writing into a future in the hopes that there will continue to be a future. And so this is not just the end all and be all, which is what we try to emphasize as well.
Another good aspect of all of this, of course, some of the officers get very into this, and when they leave the module, I'm pretty confident in saying that they're going to continue to read and write in English. But those who don't necessarily do that, one thing that does stick with them, this is a different way to look at the problems they encounter every day, the intelligence. And it's also a different way to consider how they communicate. So a lot of officers tell us this changes the way I deliver a speech, changes the way I sort of spin or talk to a superior officer about a given situation. So bottom line, it's about considerations of narrative, and those are relevant to any sort of field. So what we thought we'd do now, we bear with us here because this we were expecting a different sort of workshop-y room. But what we have, we chose a piece of intelligence, and this is from the New York Times last summer. So the overarching question here is one about climate change. So what we'd like to do is the article is scrollable? Excellent, thank you. So we're going to scroll through this article, but we also have copies, which Matt is very kindly going to pass around the room. And what we'd like to do is we're going to start reading the article, thinking the formula that we've given you, okay? Primarily A, B, D, C, E. W, 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 H, better, worse, or weird, okay? But let's focus on the A, B, D, C, E. So we're going to read, so pardon us for that tedium, but we'll be stopping periodically, and we would love to hear from you guys if you just, if an idea strikes you. But we will first proceed with the A, then on to the B, but then the further we go, number one, it becomes a little bit more amorphous or shapeless in terms of the int, but also the story starts to take shape, okay? So let's hope you'll see what we mean by that in action. So if you have the articles, etc. Okay, we're going to start on the first page. So, and again, this is not what you would do if you incorporated fic into your work life, presumably in a governmental organization or a military organization. You would choose int that is more directly relevant to the topic you need to discuss. Perhaps China and Taiwan. Perhaps, well, this is something perhaps we should emphasize, which we didn't that fully. Tech, future tech is a major, major part of fic int. So fic-int is great as a flexible genre. It allows for so many different formats. We've had great stories written in the forms of speeches delivered by a fictional character, journalism, straight up newspaper articles, an obituary, sports reporting. It allows for a lot of different formats creatively. Okay, so this particular issue is something that I was hoping we could all participate in, because it's based in Paris. And those of you who may be from Paris know that a hot Paris, as we've encountered too often of late, is a very particular Paris. So the article is titled, "Paris Braces for a Future of Possibly Paralyzing Heat," by Catherine Porter. The dateline is last summer, August. So again, I'm going to read the first 4 paragraphs and be thinking what kind of action might start a story that you want it to be about climate and climate's impact in a future Paris. So imagine Paris at 122 degrees Fahrenheit or 50 degrees Celsius. The asphalt streets would melt in spots, making it virtually impossible for ambulances and buses to pass. Right there is a whole lot of A you could choose from to start a story. The lights and fans could cut out in neighborhoods if underground cables burned or junction boxes shifted. Blackouts, brownouts, etc. Cell phone service might go down, or antennas on boiling rooftops stopped working. We have communication issues that would be relevant. Trains would halt as outdoor rails swelled, keeping nurses, firefighters, and electricity engineers from reaching their jobs when they were most needed. Those are situations city officials are already planning for.
Can I just stop you right there? Just keeping in mind, because we'll ask you later about who might be our main characters, already there you have a few jobs to choose from as you start brainstorming. Nurses, firefighters, electricity engineers, city officials. So when we think about who should be our protagonist, we want to find someone whose job and whose role in Paris would be relevant for this situation. So really, every sentence here is giving you possible clues and additions for what we're going to do later. Sorry.
So those are all possible actions. Of course, you could have many others. As Navkote said, we're going to be thinking, too, in a moment. We'll pause at a moment and try to pull together our character, sort of during the background section of this. So the 4th paragraph, a heat wave at 50 degrees is not a scenario of science fiction. Now that hits the fic-int nail right on the head. That's why we need to be thinking about these things. It may seem science fictional, but in fact it's not. A deputy mayor, that's a quote from a deputy mayor of the city, it's a possibility we need to prepare for. So one way we're suggesting we prepare is via fic-int and thinking about the problems differently. So do we have an action that we can start with? So we saw that transportation, communications, emergency services. Anyone want to volunteer an action?
Feel free to raise your hand if you have any idea.
Yeah.
Good. So if we look at transportation, so the trains and other things are stopping because they just can't move in the heat. So that leads you to the next question. Okay, who might be on that train? What might be on that train that can't get into the city? Okay, so let's say that we start with a transportation crisis. So the city is largely immobilized. Good, that can be our action. In the background, though, we have that the city progressively cannot communicate. The citizens are losing the ability to communicate. Key infrastructure is starting to shut down. We'll see further on in the article how that would impact hospitals, for example. So I'm cheating here because there's something about hospitals coming. But what if we have someone who working in the medical profession who's trying to get into the city from somewhere else in France? Okay, let's think about that. Bear that in mind. That's a lot to bear in mind. Now, Navkote is going to continue reading as we start to, yes?
Il y a la Seine, il y a des fleuves, les transports, ils sont pas arrêtés.
Okay, so maybe transportation. This is a very interesting aspect of fic-int. How often in looking forward, we end up looking back. So for example, family relationships, they're the same no matter where you're setting your story. And very often, and this could be an interesting development here, that if transportation that we've become accustomed to isn't working, do we go back to the original form of transportation in Paris and start to move on the Seine? That's a very cool wrinkle, because that allows you to look at history How did we do that? Why did we stop doing that? Could we do that again? What might that look like? Interesting point. So bear all that in mind as the beginning of a story, and now we're going to go into the background. Now, a lot of this, if you're familiar with any major city dealing with extreme heat, you'll know. And if you're familiar with Paris, you'll know in particular.
So I'll read the next paragraph, and as Jim said, we're looking now into the background. The background not only of the where, but of our upcoming protagonist as well. So France has recently experienced its second heat wave of the summer, with temperatures reaching record highs last week in the southwest and heat alerts covering 3/4 of the country. I'm going to stop there and say heat alerts. So we talked about tech. How will the city, how will the country be alerted, right? As heat progresses, as people maybe stop going to work because they're unable to. Remember that first paragraph? The asphalt streets would melt in spots. Perhaps walking in a normal fashion is not going to be possible anymore. So how does an alert system work in this new city? Think about, so that's a potential question to ask as well.
Yeah, especially in a city that's suffering a loss of all comms, because that's really how we alert each other.
In Paris, this has become the new normal. 8 of the 10 hottest summers recorded in the city since 1900 occurred since 2015. That's a really interesting way to think about time. As we talk a lot in class that the easy thing to do, the expected thing to do is, the Netflix crawl like 25 years later in Virginia. But that, it's an easy way of doing it. It's a clear way of doing it. But are there clues that we can embed in a story to kind of give us that sense of time? And so that's an interesting detail, right? So how has temperature risen? If we know that in 2015, if you're looking 10 years ahead, keep that in mind. In 2019, temperatures in Paris hit a record nearing 109 degrees. Scientists say it will get worse, particularly since climate change is warming Europe at more than twice the global average. In 2022, city officials asked climate scientists if Paris might experience heat waves that reach 50 degrees in the near future. Their answer was yes, terrifyingly, possibly by the end of the century or as soon as around 2050 if greenhouse gas emissions increase exponentially. But the scientists' modeling showed that scenario is unlikely if global pledges from the Paris Climate Accord were met and the rise in warming was kept below 2 degrees Celsius. So you have technical details there, but also think about policy details. We have the accords. We're bringing in the global average. So we're looking at France, we're looking at Paris, but how do neighboring countries, how do other capital cities in Europe perhaps affect what Paris chooses to do in our story?
I want to make the point too that that falls all of that falls under background. Doesn't mean it's all going to make it into your story, because depending on who you decide your protagonist is, who your audience is, a lot of that can be assumed. So it depends. Do you have someone who's coming from another city who knows none of that and needs to be told it? Or are you having a sort of Parisian-centered story where a lot of people might know that? But still, you have to know that. The background, some of it's on the page, all of it is behind the page as well.
Mm-hmm. Because remember also that even if we don't have that explicit background in the story, that might affect just in terms of slang, right? Just in terms of shorthand that becomes so normal that maybe there's a word that's used for, oh, it's an above 40-degree day. Things like that, right? Things that we don't even realize we casually imbibe into our language and we make casual, and we don't realize that we're doing it and that we've changed. So next page, I don't think we should bet on that as a society, said Alexandre Florentin, a green city councillor and environmental engineer who spent more than a decade working at Carbone 4, a leading French climate change mitigation and adaptation firm. Again, you know this now, you're looking at these details. Are there other think tanks, are there other places that could be incorporated into the story? He led a committee of city lawmakers from all political parties, so this is now becoming a multi-party system or issue, to examine the capital's vulnerabilities to extreme heat waves. They published their report, Paris at 50 degrees Celsius in 2023, separately from the crisis simulation. And a word that also a simulation is another type of ficant, right? Using kind of more practical means, using a more 360-degree approach to use narrative to think ahead a little bit. They found that there were temperature thresholds that could cause widespread breakdowns, leading to a cascade of crippling domino effects. During an interview with a hospital director, for example, Mr. Florentin learned that the medical center's air conditioning system was designed to work only when the outside temperature was about 109 degrees or lower. Any higher and it would break down and the hospital would be forced to close its operating rooms and send urgent cases to other hospitals. What would happen if they have the same problem? He didn't have an answer. He added, as long as that threshold is passed, we face domino effects.
Domino effects is a very cool thing in terms of fiction. One thing naturally leads to another, and the stakes continue to rise. A couple of things there. So first of all, we have the notion of a hospital. We mentioned that earlier. I found this frightening. Hospitals, once 109 degrees is reached, they will just stop functioning. And earlier in the story, we see that in 2019, that has already happened. So again, we go back to our person who's trying to get into the city, maybe trying to get to work at a hospital. Maybe their hospital is shutting down. And this is a bizarre concept because it was never built to function at more than 109 degrees. And so it's just starting to shut down. So what's the question there? Do we stop? Do we start a triage system? Who is deserving of operating when we can't operate on everyone? Do we start moving patients from different hospitals? What are the hospital specialties? What happens if you go to a hospital, a children's hospital, suddenly starts receiving adult patients because there's nowhere else to go? You see how the stakes progressively rise, and again, the domino effects. So all of this we will settle on in a moment when we think about our character, or maybe we're there now with our character. So let's just make some decisions, okay? What is a factor in your decision? We've already sort of, I guess I decided, that it is a hospital worker coming in on a train who can't get into the city, okay? Now, significant questions here. What's the gender of your protagonist? I'll be thinking too, who might be the antagonist, which is always of interest. So who's the protagonist? What's their gender? Why does it matter? Point of view. What's their nationality? Why does that matter? Because one of the interesting sort of tricks in fiction is you can do a lot with someone who's in a place they don't know, because they have to ask questions. They don't have the information that other people have. So it's organic, I mean, it happens, but it's also a bit of a trick in terms of getting exposition and more of the int smoothly into your story. So now let's just make the decision. Say we have a woman who's trying to get into Paris. Let's come back and say, where is she coming from? Because this presumably would be a nationwide heat thing, so maybe she's dealing with other family elsewhere. She's trying to get to her job to see if her hospital is even open. Meanwhile, we're going to see in a moment, schools are severely impacted. So perhaps she has children. Perhaps she has a partner she can't communicate with, who's she hopes is going to get the children if their school isn't open. So you see how this really starts to pressurize, and a pressurized narrative engages the reader. An engaged reader is someone who's very open to being hit on the head by the end with the impact that you want to create.
And just a word here, we obviously, this is not the time, we don't have the time for this, but if we were looking at this in class, immediately what comes to mind is, and this came to me when you were talking about, do we have a triage system where some people are more deserving? Does that mean that someone who's a citizen will get treatment first? So then, of course, what ends up happening, you have another int, right? You have the question of immigration. How is immigration affected by climate change? We already see that happening today, but how will that be exacerbated in the story? So the knock-on effects, the domino effects, are not just for the characters, but it's also in terms of how one piece of int inevitably comes up against and intersects with other types of int.
Yeah, and there's a tendency to try to cram it all in. So I want to make the point, too, that a workable piece of fiction, by our standards, which is a 7 or 8 page short story, you can probably only successfully incorporate 5 or 6 ideas. But as Navkoti was just saying, perhaps immigration or income inequality is in the background. Maybe all you have to do is have someone walk into a crowded hospital corridor or something and be able to be told or seen that, who knows, those who have private insurance, there's my American side coming into the story, are being favored over those who don't, etc. So not everything has to be front and center. You will choose the int that is front and center, but be thinking about what can be functioning in the background. Again, always wanting to pressurize the narrative, because that makes it more engaging. Showing things, not telling. That's an age-old dictum in terms of creative writing. You want to show, not tell, because by showing, you allow the reader to connect the dots. And a reader who's allowed to do that is an engaged reader. And again, that is your ultimate goal, an engaged reader.
So yes, very interesting point here before moving on to the next page about int. For example, time frame. You know, we mentioned the 47th president and maybe the 53rd. Maybe you can also imagine something like the COP 45 maybe. So all this kind of stuff is already here in this kind of article. And also another cool detail is 50 degrees Celsius. As a helicopter pilot, I know that you can't take off at such a high temperature. So this is also some very interesting stuff to build your story. And just imagine, okay, if there is an emergency, we won't be able to use the helicopter because of. And this is this kind of bridge that helps us to show, don't tell. So
that's a very good point, Matt, because if someone told me, and we had this discussion, me and Matt, told me like the science of not being able to land a helicopter, 80% of it goes right over my head. Too technical for me. But when you humanize it, okay, you mean we can't, medical evacuations in a certain area are no longer possible because the helicopters can't land? For me, I get that. And so again, engagement.
So let's move on to the next page. Another important finding was the vulnerability of schools should a heat wave hit during the school year, like in late June. The classes will close and that will have rippling consequences all through society, Mr. Florentin said. If their parents work at the hospital or the electricity facility, there will be bigger problems. So very interesting hint there, meaning understaffing at crucial times. His strongest recommendation was for the city to invest more in green and shaded yards and to transform school into passive cooling centers with designs that allow for more air circulation or geothermal cooling system, not electricity, which is also very interesting here, because from that we can elaborate some other technologies, some other techs that are not existing yet for the moment, but maybe will within a time frame of 15 years. Paris is particularly ill-adapted to heat waves. A 2023 study published in the London-based medical journal The Lancet, which is a cool source, deemed it the European capital whose residents were most exposed to heat-related deaths.
That's a scary sentence to pause on. So again, it's the European capital whose residents were most exposed to heat-related deaths.
The city has the highest population density in Europe, and those people are packed into buildings without insulation, with zinc roofs built for the city's historically moderate winters and summers, explained Franck Lirzan, author of the 2022 book Paris in the Face of Climate Change. Many of its main squares are paved in stone and ringed with asphalt roads, transforming them into radiators that helps increase the city temperatures by as much as 10 degrees Celsius compared with the countryside nearby.
This makes me think of infrastructure, right? So architecturally, so a word also about tech is that one of the reasons why we try to keep it to the 10, 15 year range is also because if you go farther, tech moves so quickly that it's really hard to predict what we will have at our disposal, even frankly, within that 10 to 15 year time span. But what you don't want to do is fall into the trap of inventing something that just fixes the whole thing. So we try really hard to keep with the technology we have now, or at the very least technology that we can safely estimate will be available to us based on what we have now. But immediately when I thought about that comment about the paving stones, insulation, I was thinking, well, feasibly, what could be changed, right? We are not going to do a raise to the ground and then build up a new type of city, although that would be a cool science fiction idea. But for Fikent, that's not really possible. So what elements could be brought in, and we'll see that in the article here.
For example, the tech stories about incorporating AI, they risk becoming obsolete by the afternoon of the morning they were written. So that's one thing. Another thing that we've noticed too, which is a hurdle that you have to get over to make Fikent really a workable and practical and beneficial exercise, is getting over what I came to term as news blindness. We did this with a corporation once, and the headlines were so overwhelming that we found that the groups creatively couldn't get past the present into the future, meaning that every bad guy had a name that sounded an awful lot like Musk, etc. So that's another interesting challenge about the tech and also about the news. So it's not as easy as it might seem to sort of cast your gaze over those hurdles into a future.
So we're going to start thinking now about development, right? We have our protagonist, currently unnamed, so start thinking about a name for her. But we have transport being kind of the action that takes us there. The background, of course, is that we are in the middle of this heat wave. Infrastructure is falling apart. She maybe is coming from a hotter climate in France, going towards Paris. We'll think about, and let's say she has kids here, we don't know. She has family in Paris, that's why she's here. But now we want to think about development. We want to think about conflicts, we want to think about challenges, we want to think about the bulk of the narrative as we keep reading.
Yeah. And I wanted to add too that we always encounter the officers to, if they do something that they've seen before, then we ask them to do something they haven't seen before. So in thinking about this, maybe our person who's coming in is dedicated, a doctor or nurse trying to get to her hospital. Maybe she has kids in the city, but maybe they're not her kids. Maybe it's her sister's kids. These are her sister's kids. Maybe her sister is still down south dealing with their aging parents in this heat. And in this particular case, we are well aware that Paris has a horrific history when it comes to the knock-on effects of extreme weather, which the article goes on to cover here.
Yep. Just under 15,000 people died from heat-related causes in 2003 during a heat wave that hit France that August. Many were older adults living in apartments that had zinc roofs with no insulation or air conditioning, according to reports by national lawmakers and the National Public Health Agency. In response, the country drafted its first national heat wave plan and introduced a system of registering isolated older or disabled people so that they could be checked on during heat waves. That paragraph, to me, is pretty rich when it comes to drawing out details. First of all, we have populations, we know who's most vulnerable. So that's interesting in terms of, also, when you talk about fiction, it can sound a little bit callous. That's interesting. Those people will be targeted. But it is how you raise stakes, right? That's how you create kind of an emotional response, hopefully, from your reader. But we also know the first national heat wave plan. How does that evolve? How many heat wave plans are there before either they're disbanded, there's another system brought into place? That system of registering older or disabled people is very interesting as well. Admin is an interesting topic when it comes to FICINT. How does admin involve? We've seen even now, right? Call centers, the idea of talking to a person when you call a 1-800 number, not anymore, right? Like you have an AI. So again, how might that evolve as we move forward? Given the surprising speed of climate change, the lessons of 2003 already seem outdated. The climatologists tell us that 2003 heat wave will be considered a cool summer soon, Mr. Florentin said. We must prepare for much worse. The city's emergency simulation presumed a 2-week heat wave, with temperatures surging to near 115 degrees and forecasts for 122. City workers focused on 2 Parisian neighborhoods, shuttling elementary and middle school children to climate shelters set up in an abandoned train tunnel and an underground parking lot. Take it away.
There's an interesting question too. Which Parisian neighborhoods might you choose? And those of you who know Paris well know that's a loaded decision. So again, that would fall under background. Background very readily segues into development. If you choose something in the 20th versus something in the 16th, et cetera, lots of decisions will fall into place under that.
That drill was followed by a tabletop exercise to see how firefighters, police officers, hospital staff members, the Red Cross, and others would interact and respond. The big lesson from the exercise was that Parisians are not ready, Ms. Comites said.
And all of that, they call it a table exercise, all of that is nothing but FICINT. And as you said, sort of running, what was the word? Running, we had it a minute ago. Different ways of conceiving of the future. And FICINT falls into that category.
So we're coming towards the end of the article, of course, but where do we think, does anyone have any ideas of development? Where do we want to take this? So we have a protagonist, we have how she arrives in Paris, we've identified that perhaps she's coming to Paris to pick up, we've decided, her sister's kids, there are 2 of them, and she needs to get them because they have elderly parents that the sister's dealing with. What next? What from this article? So, what are things that have struck you that you think might be interesting as we try to raise the stakes, as we try to build tension
and work toward a climax?
Yes. Everyone's like, I'm not going to stretch.
We understand this room is not most conducive to a workshop, so I guess you can watch us workshop.
There we go.
Is it something about maybe the catacomb? Can we explore something about this because of to protect from heat wave? Maybe there's
That would
a
be
hidden
a
network.
very cool setting. What maybe some of the abandoned, or actually the actual metro stations. If the metro presumably is shut down with some of the rails that are above ground, maybe the metro, a lot of the city goes underground, maybe even way underground into the catacombs. Now that would be a very cool setting. So if we think about the climax, so we have this, we have a name, you want to give her a name?
Linda.
Linda. Okay, Linda with a Y.
Yeah.
Okay, so she's coming into the city and she wants to get to work. There may not be work. Meanwhile, she's responsible for her niece and nephew because her sister is dealing, let's say, with one of her parents. Perhaps they lost the other parent in the heat wave in Paris or something. Again, you want to humanize, not make light of any of this, but humanize it so it has more of an impact. What might a climax be? She gets to the city. She can't get a hold of her sister. She's incommunicado. She gets to the school and finds out that the school children have been moved, perhaps to the catacombs. Oh, would they even do that to? I would,
bit
but I don't.
creepy, but maybe.
Well, there are also those people, I forget their name, but the people who know the catacombs really well, and their whole thing is that they do, is there...
Cataphile.
There we go. Like, again, I'm thinking now in terms of a movie, but that would be really cool, right? These people who have been like on the wrong side of the law, they come in and they go, no, we know what to do. And they, I don't know, they evacuate the school, and then they take them to the catacombs.
I love it. We're going full Hollywood here.
Because you can see the scene.
So let's say that Linda couldn't get to the school in time, and they had to move the students. The students were starting to faint. The 3D shelter wasn't even strong enough. So an older brother, perhaps, of one of the other students shows up, takes a rogue band of students, and the kids are digging it, and they end up going to the catacombs, where they're safe and cool, but no one knows they're there, including their parents. That's a problem. So the climax could be the loss of the child. Where are these children I'm responsible for? Now as we start to sort of down to the ending of the story, and the ending of the story is not just how it ends, but why does it end the way it ends? How is the protagonist completely different, having undergone this arc? What has the city shown as its weaknesses in this given situation? So if we want to go happy ending, I have to tell you that a lot of Fickent is not about happy endings. It doesn't often accommodate a lot of humor. We read a satirical story the other day with the officers trying to see, by Kurt Vonnegut, trying to see if satire could play a role in Fickent. Difficult to achieve. Typically, these are warning signals, these stories, but we're not going to, as one student did, remember, he killed everyone at the end? It's not gonna be, we're not going to let that happen. So the ending, as we go from the climax, Linda, let's say she finds the children. Okay. She also maybe finds a way to communicate with her sister, relays the message to the grandparents. Happy ending. I think if we pushed, we could get a little more creative than that. But that's the loose sort of arc of how we put together a story like this. So again, think of it as a film. Understand this is not what we do on a daily basis here. We have 12 or 15 weeks to workshop long-form fiction or short-form fiction, short stories. But I'm hoping that this gives you an idea, before we get into a Q&A, of what the whole process looks like. So again, those formula, those artistic formulas, A, B, D, C, E. If you're looking at a blank page, it's a good way to just try to get something on the page. The who, what, where, when, and how, you have to communicate all of that to your reader. And you want to do it subtly. No one wants that information just delivered as it would be in a memo, subtly, okay? And then better, worse, or weird. This comes down to how do you conceive the idea that you've challenged yourself with exploring, the message that you want to convey. Do you convey it, do you conceive it as being in a future that is better, worse, or weird, or some combination of all three? So that's pretty much what Fickent looks like from our perspective. We like to think that it's been a very nice addition to professional military education here. We hear the same from the officers. We had an officer a few years ago who actually used fiction to try to sell his superior officer on a key personnel hire. He said it worked. So again, thinking about narrative, no matter what you're doing, if you have a different perspective on narrative, there's real world value in that. Any final comments before we open it up to a Q&A?
No, it's perfect.
Thank you.
So I think that's it. Again, thank you very much, Jim and Nafcote, for this amazing workshop. Also,
Thank you to
you
you.
to Ms. Claire for as a head of
Thank you,
department.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you.